dollars untouched and their dog locked inside, starving. Security footage shows them moving in eerie, trance-like silence. And years later, their skeletal remains turned up with no answers. Jamison family had dreams, simple ones. A life away from noise, a fresh start, and land they could call their own. Bobby Dale Jamison and his wife Sherilyn lived in Eufaula, Oklahoma, a quiet small town that had its own pace. It wasn't paradise, but it was home. With them was their 6-year-old daughter, Madison, a bright, playful child who brought light even to their darkest days. Yet something wasn't right. Friends had noticed it. Family too. There was a tension, unspoken, creeping, always present. And by October of 2009, that tension was boiling over. Bobby, once lively and driven, had become increasingly reclusive. After a serious car accident left him with chronic back pain, he spent most of his days either in bed or lost in thought. He had become withdrawn, distant even from his daughter. Sherilyn, too, carried shadows of her own. She was said to be struggling with depression, possibly bipolar disorder. Her moods would swing, bright and loving one day, cold and unreachable the next. The Jamison home felt like a house weighed down by invisible pressure. Arguments, long silences, then periods of strange intensity. Their financial situation wasn't good either. The family was barely scraping by. Yet, despite everything, Bobby had come across a curious opportunity. A 40-acre parcel of land deep in the San Bois Mountains. Isolated, quiet, cheap. Just the kind of place they thought might bring peace. It wasn't impulsive. They'd talked about it for weeks, getting off the grid, starting fresh, living out of a storage container while they built something new. They wanted to escape, not just the town, but something else, something they never fully explained. On October 8th, 2009, the Jamisons loaded up their white pickup truck with supplies. Water, jackets, a GPS. They brought their dog, Maisie, and a wad of cash, $32,000, neatly packed away. No one knew why they had that kind of money. No one asked. They drove off that morning without telling anyone where exactly they were headed. It was supposed to be a short trip, just a few hours. They never returned. When the Jamisons didn't return home that evening, no one panicked. It wasn't unusual for them to go off-grid for a bit. They valued their privacy. But as days passed, concern began to stir. Family members tried calling, no answer. Texts went unread. Eventually, a report was filed. Then, on October 17th, 9 days after they had vanished, hunters stumbled upon their white pickup truck abandoned on a remote dirt road deep in the San Bois Mountains. What they found inside would send shockwaves through the small Oklahoma community. The truck looked untouched, doors slightly ajar, the family's belongings scattered inside, but nothing appeared stolen or broken. Their mobile phones lay still on the seats. Bobby's wallet and Sherilyn's purse remained inside. Their IDs, GPS, even Madison's coat. Everything was there. And then there was the cash. Over $32,000 in a bank bag, just sitting in the vehicle, completely untouched. No sign of theft, no signs of panic. It was as if they had stepped out of the truck and vanished into the trees. The most haunting discovery, however, was Maisie, their dog. She was barely alive, weak, starving, dehydrated, but she had waited, alone in the truck, for over a week. Her survival raised even more questions. If the Jamisons had meant to leave, why would they abandon their child's dog to die? And if they were taken against their will, why was there no struggle, no broken glass, no blood, no drag marks in the dirt, just a silent, untouched truck in the middle of nowhere? Law enforcement was baffled. They searched the surrounding area, combed the terrain with dogs, ATVs, and helicopters. Nothing, not a single trace. It was as if the woods had swallowed them whole. As investigators retraced the family's steps, a series of strange details began to surface. Details that shifted the case from a simple disappearance to something far more unsettling. People began asking questions. What were the Jamisons running from? And why did everything they left behind suggest they had no intention of ever coming back? The investigation moved quickly from search and rescue to something more ominous. Detectives combed through the Jamisons' past, hoping to piece together the final days before their vanishing. What they found only deepened the mystery. Security footage from the family's own surveillance camera showed Bobby and Sherilyn loading their truck just hours before they left. But the footage wasn't normal. It was unsettling. The couple moved with strange, robotic precision. They made over 20 silent trips back and forth from the house to the truck, never speaking, never acknowledging one another. There was no visible urgency, no signs of distress, just eerie silence. Sherilyn appeared to carry a brown briefcase in one clip. That briefcase would never be found, nor would her handgun, which was usually kept inside. The footage became a cornerstone of the case, feeding endless speculation. Some believed they were drugged. Others suggested some kind of trance or cult involvement. But no theory could explain why two seemingly rational adults would behave that way just before disappearing forever. Investigators also discovered that Bobby had been acting paranoid in the weeks leading up to their trip. He believed he and his family were being targeted. He claimed to see shadowy figures lurking around their home. He spoke of spiritual warfare and dark forces watching them. In Bobby's truck, police found a strange letter he had written, an angry, rambling 11-page document directed at Sherilyn. It was filled with accusations, rage, and despair. It wasn't clear if it was ever meant to be read. Sherilyn, too, had her demons. Friends said she sometimes spoke of witchcraft. She once spray-painted strange phrases on a shipping container in their yard. One of them read, "Witches don't like it when their cats are killed." Investigators weren't sure what to make of it, whether it was a metaphor, a cry for help, or something darker. As these fragments of their lives surfaced, the picture of the Jamison family began to blur. It no longer looked like a peaceful family seeking a new start. It looked like a family unraveling, slowly, quietly, and completely. The search for the Jamisons stretched into weeks, then months. Authorities explored every lead, from the logical to the bizarre. The San Bois Mountains were scoured repeatedly, but the terrain was unforgiving, dense, rocky, isolated. It was easy to get lost, even easier to stay lost. Despite exhaustive efforts, no bodies, clothing, or personal items turned up, no witnesses, no credible tips, just silence. The case grew cold, but the theories didn't. Rumors circulated around Eufaula. Some believed the family had staged their disappearance and fled the country. Others were sure it was a drug deal gone wrong. A handful whispered darker things, that the Jamisons had been cursed, that something supernatural had followed them into the woods. With no hard evidence to go on, the investigation stalled. But beneath the surface of speculation were facts that refused to sit quietly. Bobby had reportedly met with a man just days before the disappearance, someone he planned to buy land from. That man later told investigators that the meeting felt off. Bobby had seemed distracted, constantly looking over his shoulder. The man said Bobby was clutching a folder filled with maps and numbers, as if he were preparing for more than just a land deal. The folder was never recovered. Sherilyn had recently cut ties with a close friend after accusing her of being involved in dark magic. Her moods had grown unpredictable. At one point, she allegedly confided in someone that she believed she was a witch. Whether she was joking, delusional, or sincere remained unclear. But one thing was certain. Both Bobby and Sherilyn were deeply unsettled in the final weeks of their lives. Meanwhile, family members began stepping forward with stories that hadn't previously been told. Sherilyn's mother claimed the family was haunted, literally. She believed dark spirits had attached themselves to the Jamisons. Bobby's father was brought into the picture as well, a man Bobby once accused of threatening the family. He denied everything. The deeper investigators dug, the more tangled the Jamison case became. It felt less like a missing persons investigation, and more like the unraveling of a dark and private mythology. As public interest grew, so did the web of theories. Online forums buzzed with speculation. Some users dissected the surveillance footage frame by frame, convinced the Jamisons were under some kind of influence. Others fixated on the $32,000 found in the truck. Where did it come from? Why would a struggling family carry such a large sum into the wilderness without telling anyone? There were no bank withdrawals recorded. No one could trace the origin of the money. Theories ranged from drug trafficking to hidden debts, but no evidence ever confirmed either. The dog, Maisie, became a symbol of the mystery. She had been found emaciated, barely alive, but alive nonetheless. Veterinarians estimated she'd been locked in the vehicle for at least a week. How had she survived that long? And more importantly, how had the Jamisons vanished without a single trace while leaving her behind? The truck itself offered no answers. No fingerprints beyond the family's, no signs of forced entry, no blood, no weapons, just dust and silence. Investigators revisited the family's home in Eufaula. They hoped to find something, anything, that might explain the behavior caught on camera or the disappearance that followed. What they found instead was confusion. The house was in disarray, but not in a way that suggested a hurried exit. It was more like a slow unraveling. Papers scattered, personal items left out. Sherilyn's diary had entries that veered into the surreal, filled with cryptic thoughts and mood swings. Nothing pointed to a plan, and yet everything hinted at one. Even more disturbing was the absence of closure. Missing persons posters stayed up for months, fading under the Oklahoma sun. The Jamisons' relatives clung to hope, but doubt crept in. No one could understand how 3 people could disappear so completely. The vast landscape where they vanished was searched over and over again. Drones, cadaver dogs, thermal imaging, all failed. The case began to feel less like a mystery and more like a riddle, one carved out of fear, silence, and a family history full of secrets. Four years passed with no answers. The Jamison family remained missing, a haunting absence that hovered over Eufaula and beyond. Occasionally, a tip would surface, a sighting, a hiker's story, a psychic's vision, but none of it led anywhere. For law enforcement, the case became a haunting cold file. For the public, it became legend. The mystery deepened with time, turning the Jamisons into ghostly figures lost in the fog of folklore. But then, in November of 2013, everything changed. A group of hunters walking through a wooded area just 3 miles from where the truck had been found stumbled upon a grim discovery. Scattered in the dirt, partially hidden by leaves and debris, were skeletal remains. 2 adults, 1 child, no clothing, no signs of struggle, just bones lying side by side, as if the family had laid down and gone to sleep forever. The location had already been searched multiple times in previous years, yet somehow the remains had gone unnoticed. Or perhaps they hadn't been there all along. The remains were sent for testing. Within days, dental records confirmed what many had feared. Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison had finally been found. But even in discovery, the mystery only deepened. The medical examiner could find no definitive cause of death. There were no signs of trauma, no bullet wounds, no fractures, no defensive injuries. The bones were too weathered, too scattered by time and nature to tell a complete story. But what they did tell was unsettling. There had been no attempt to bury the bodies, no shelter nearby, no indication of how or why they ended up there. Theories began to spin again. If they died of exposure, why didn't they try to return to the truck? It was only a few miles away. If they were murdered, why no wounds? And if it was suicide, where were the drugs, the method, the message? Their final resting place raised more questions than it answered. The discovery brought an end to the search, but not to the questions. The Jamisons were no longer missing. They were something worse, present, but still unknowable. As the community tried to process the discovery, investigators returned to the beginning, combing through every detail once more, searching for something they might have missed. The truck, the money, the surveillance footage, the family's mental state, it all came back into focus. But with the bodies now found and no clear cause of death, every piece of evidence seemed to carry new weight, new implications. The once speculative theories began to feel disturbingly plausible. Among the most talked about theories was that the Jamisons had died as part of a suicide pact. Some believed they had driven into the wilderness with the intention of ending their lives together. The presence of cash, personal belongings, and their dogs seemed to contradict that. But others pointed to Sherilyn's history of depression and Bobby's growing paranoia. Their behavior on camera, the odd silence, the list of names found in Bobby's belongings, everything painted a picture of a couple spiraling out of control. Another theory was murder. Perhaps someone had lured them into the woods and executed them without leaving a trace. But who and why? The cache was untouched. There was no evidence of robbery or revenge. No enemies had been identified. Still, locals whispered about meth activity in the region. Remote areas like the San Bois Mountains were known for illegal operations, and some speculated the family had seen something they shouldn't have. If that were true, though, wouldn't there be signs of violence? Then there were those who refused to believe any rational explanation. The Jamisons' interest in the paranormal had never sat right with some. Sherilyn had once claimed their house was haunted. Bobby believed spirits had attached themselves to them. Friends recalled conversations about exorcisms, ghost sightings, and dark energy. These weren't one-time remarks. They were recurring fears. Whether real or imagined, the Jamisons seemed to be fighting something invisible long before they vanished. Each theory, while compelling, had gaping holes. There were too many contradictions, too many loose ends. In the end, the mystery didn't shrink with the discovery of the bodies. It grew. The answers everyone hoped for never came. And the silence surrounding their deaths became its own kind of horror. Back at the Jamison residence, investigators found more than just clutter and chaos. They uncovered layers of a household in psychological decline. One room had odd spray-painted messages scrawled across the walls, cryptic phrases that hinted at fear and defiance. A makeshift altar stood in a corner, covered in candles, trinkets, and symbols that didn't quite make sense. Whether it was spiritual expression, mental illness, or something darker was anyone's guess. Neighbors began to speak up. One described hearing yelling late into the night. Another remembered Sherilyn pacing in her yard alone, mumbling to herself, eyes darting toward the woods. Bobby, once friendly, had become distant and agitated, He was convinced someone had placed a curse on his family. He often claimed to see shadowy figures watching from the tree line. Sherilyn once told a friend she believed she could communicate with spirits. She even tried to perform what she called protection rituals around the property. The couple's relationships with their families were strained at best. Bobby had a particularly toxic relationship with his father, whom he accused of threatening and trying to harm him. Though no charges were ever filed, the feud was well known. Bobby was pursuing a lawsuit against his father at the time of his disappearance, adding yet another layer of tension to an already volatile environment. Then came a curious discovery. Sherilyn had reportedly brought a gun on the trip. She had a .22 caliber pistol, which she kept in her purse. That gun was never found. Some believe it could have played a role in their deaths, but if it had, no ballistic evidence was ever recovered from the remains. The lack of physical clues kept speculation alive and ever evolving. Despite the passage of time, nothing ever seemed to clarify the events. The more facts were uncovered, the more surreal the case became. It was as if the Jamisons' final weeks were soaked in confusion, paranoia, and a creeping dread that no one around them fully understood. Whatever happened in those mountains didn't start there. It started long before at home, behind walls that no one really saw until it was too late. Investigators turned to the science of digital forensics, poring over thousands of data points taken from the Jamisons' phones and the GPS unit left in the truck. The devices revealed a breadcrumb trail of coordinates that painted an erratic journey through the San Bois backroads on the morning they vanished. They stopped, restarted, and doubled back several times, as though searching for something invisible. At one uphill spur, they parked for 12 minutes without exiting, engine idling. Then they drove 3 miles farther, turned onto a logging track, and switched the engine off for good. The coordinates ended there, exactly where the pickup was later found, suggesting the family never re-entered the vehicle once they stepped outside. Forensic analysts also examined text drafts and deleted voicemail fragments. Bobby had typed but never sent a message to his father. "You know what you did." Another unsent draft to a friend read, "If anything happens to us, look in the mountains." Sherilyn's phone contained a photo of Madison taken just minutes before the final GPS ping. The child is standing by a moss-covered boulder, smiling awkwardly, sunlight filtering through pine needles. Behind her, the forest recedes into darkness. Officers who viewed the image said it felt like a farewell. While the digital trail gave timestamps, it offered no motive. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation convened a panel of profilers who reviewed the Jamisons' medical records and behavioral changes. They concluded the couple was experiencing a shared psychotic disorder, folie à deux, where Bobby's paranoia fed Sherilyn's depression, creating a closed loop of delusional thinking. In that fragile state, any perceived threat could have driven them to flee deeper into the wilderness, possibly succumbing to hypothermia within hours. Yet skeptics pointed out the weather on October 8th was mild, temperatures well above freezing. Hypothermia seemed unlikely, and the family had water, jackets, and food in the truck. Moreover, the remains were found on a gentle slope, not in a hidden ravine. Nothing physically prevented them from returning to the pickup. Critics argued the folie à deux diagnosis explained the paranoia, but not the logistics of 3 people lying down to die side by side. Late in 2014, an independent geophysicist mapped the terrain with LiDAR and located an abandoned mine shaft less than 200 yards downhill from the Jamison site. He suggested toxic gas burps from the shaft might have overwhelmed the family, causing sudden collapse. Tests months later found no abnormal levels, leaving the idea unverified yet tantalizing. The shaft has since been sealed completely. As theories expanded and explanations faltered, the Jamison case began to attract a different kind of attention. Paranormal researchers, spiritualists, and fringe investigators began circling the story like vultures over a carcass of unanswered questions. Some claimed the family had been targeted by malevolent entities. Others believed the land they intended to buy was cursed, a place where strange disappearances had occurred before. While law enforcement dismissed such claims as distractions, the spiritual undertones of the case refused to be ignored. Sherilyn had been deeply interested in the occult. Friends recalled her practicing rituals, drawing protective symbols around the property, and even attempting to exorcise spirits she believed had latched onto her daughter. One neighbor said Sherilyn had once confided that Madison would often speak to someone invisible, someone she called the Dark Man. At the time, it seemed like a child's imagination. In hindsight, it felt like something else entirely. Bobby had also taken part in these beliefs, not out of curiosity, but out of fear. He once told a friend that he kept a Bible in every room of the house, claiming they offered protection from something unseen. The house itself became part of the legend. After their disappearance, new tenants moved in and later claimed to experience strange occurrences, footsteps when no one was home, doors that opened and slammed shut on their own, shadows that moved without light. Eventually, the home was abandoned again, as if the very walls were saturated with the unresolved weight of what had happened. Meanwhile, Bobby's lawsuit against his father took on a new dimension. He had accused his father of threats, embezzlement, and even hints of violence. Though the case never went to court, some theorists believed there was more to it than anyone had realized. Could the disappearance have been a warning? A silencing? There was no evidence linking Bobby's father to the vanishing. But the timing of the suit and the family's fears seemed too sharp to ignore. The truth was slowly drowning under layers of superstition, mistrust, and time. Every path investigators explored seemed to loop back on itself, spiraling into a tangle of rational dead ends and irrational possibilities. The case had started as a missing persons report. It was now something else, a riddle soaked in paranoia, loss, and whispers from the dark edges of belief. Even as years passed, the Jamison case never truly faded. It lingered in the minds of locals, resurfaced in online forums, and found its way into late-night discussions on paranormal podcasts. The more time went by, the more the lines between fact and folklore began to blur. People no longer spoke of the Jamisons as just a missing family. They spoke of them as symbols, representations of how a family could slip so completely out of the world without warning, without violence, without reason. Madison's presence haunted the story most. A bright, innocent child caught in the spiral of her parents' unraveling. Family photos circulated, her small hand curled in Bobby's, her face pressed into Sherilyn's shoulder. Those images, frozen in time, stood in sharp contrast to the silent woods where her bones were eventually found. What kind of final moments had she endured? Did she understand what was happening? Did she suffer? These questions were perhaps the most unbearable and the ones that could never be answered. Some investigators quietly admitted they believed the truth was buried in the minds of Bobby and Sherilyn. A shared breakdown, a joint escape from a world they believed was closing in on them. Others weren't so sure. Private detectives, hired by curious outsiders and internet sleuths, explored everything from cult activity to remote homicides staged to look accidental. Some even suggested the entire scene was a setup: planted bodies, misleading clues, a faked disappearance orchestrated by powerful people. But these theories always lacked something vital: proof. One of the few consistent details was the money. $32,000 untouched in the truck. That kind of cash in a struggling household was unheard of. Some believed it was tied to a drug connection, though no substance use was ever documented. Others thought it was meant to pay for something illicit, an escape, perhaps, or protection from a threat they could never fully name. But if it was meant to buy safety, it clearly failed. Eventually, authorities closed the case officially, listing the cause of death as undetermined. No arrests were made. No new evidence ever surfaced. The forest, quiet and unmoved, offered no further answers. The Jamison case was sealed, but never solved. And in the absence of truth, the story only grew, passed on like a ghost story around a campfire, impossible to forget and impossible to explain. There was a chilling symmetry in how the Jamisons were found, side by side, as if they had chosen to lie down together in the woods. But there were no blankets, no signs of preparation, no attempt to shelter themselves from the elements. Just bones, undisturbed by animals, scattered only by time. For some, that detail alone defied nature. In a forest filled with predators and scavengers, how had their remains remained so intact? The child's bones especially, smaller and more fragile, should have been lost first, yet they weren't. It was as if even the wilderness had decided to leave them alone. Investigators tried to rationalize it. Perhaps they became lost and exhausted, sat down to rest, and never got up. Maybe they were dehydrated or exposed to something toxic. But none of that explained the untouched water in the truck or the supplies that could have sustained them for days. Nor did it explain why they left everything behind without a single indication of distress. No emergency calls, no trail markers, no attempt to return. They just vanished into the trees, leaving behind a vehicle full of life-saving resources. There were whispers that the family had fallen into something ancient and inescapable. The San Bois Mountains were old, older than the towns around them, older than any story. Indigenous tribes once believed the land was cursed, that certain parts should never be disturbed. Those stories had faded from most memories, but not all. Local folklore spoke of spirits that mimicked voices, of lights that led travelers astray. Some believed the Jamisons had followed something into the trees, something that called to them. Even those who rejected the supernatural couldn't shake the unease. This wasn't a typical missing persons case. Too many layers, too many contradictions. A family in distress, but not chaotic. A house full of warning signs, but no final message. A truck full of tools and money, abandoned without purpose. A child full of life, swallowed by stillness. The Jamison case became a scar on the landscape, an open wound in the fabric of logic. Documentaries were made. Journalists returned year after year. Psychics and skeptics walked the same forest trails, each hoping for an answer. But none came. What was left was silence. A silence too deliberate to be natural. A silence that still lingers, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to walk into it and ask why. Over time, the Jamison case evolved into something more than just a mystery. It became a litmus test for belief, where people projected their own fears, theories, and questions onto a story that refused to resolve. The family's disappearance and eventual discovery didn't fit neatly into any known narrative. It didn't align with typical criminal behavior, nor did it follow the patterns of accidental death. It hovered somewhere in between, an anomaly that seemed to repel logic. The more investigators tried to explain it, the further the truth seemed to drift. Law enforcement revisited the case files periodically, hoping time or perspective might offer new insight. But each re-examination only reinforced the same maddening reality. Everything was there, and nothing made sense. No fingerprints beyond their own. No one seen with them before they vanished. No record of enemies, debts, or affiliations that might suggest motive. It was as if they had vanished in front of an invisible curtain, one that only opened again once they were bones. A forensic pathologist eventually proposed a theory that the family may have succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning if they had attempted to stay overnight in the vehicle or near a gas-powered source. But there was no evidence of such equipment, and the truck wasn't running when it was found. The theory, like the others, was plausible, but hollow. Each possibility seemed like a whisper against a wall of silence. Each answer dissolved the moment it was held up to the facts. Public interest in the case continued to swell. Online communities created elaborate timelines, digital recreations, and psychological profiles. Some analyzed the layout of their home. Others examined satellite images of the land. Every detail became a clue. Every inconsistency, a crack in the surface of normalcy. It was no longer just about the Jamisons. It was about the nature of reality, the fragility of logic, and the question no one wanted to ask out loud. What if there are things we simply can't understand? To this day, the Jamison case is discussed not just because of its facts, but because of its atmosphere. It didn't just happen, it lingered. It left behind a feeling that something walked beside the family that day in the forest. Something wordless. Something that closed the door behind them, and even now that door hasn't opened again. Years later, the woods where the Jamisons were last seen remain untouched by development. Locals avoid the area, not out of superstition, they say, but out of respect. Still, there's an unease that clings to those trees. Hunters walk wider circles, hikers mark their trails more carefully. It's not just about what happened to the Jamisons, it's the fact that no one can say how or why. The forest is quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It's the kind of quiet that listens. In Eufaula, the family's absence is still felt. Their house was eventually sold, but not easily. Rumors followed it, and more than one buyer backed out after stepping inside. Some claimed the place had a heaviness, an atmosphere that couldn't be cleaned away. Others simply said it felt like it didn't want to be lived in. Today it stands vacant again, windows clouded by time, doors unopened. The grass grows tall around it, as if trying to erase the memory altogether. For Madison's remaining family, the grief never settled. Her grandparents stopped giving interviews. Friends who once spoke openly about the case now respond with silence. The story became too heavy, too warped by what-ifs and dead ends. Sherilyn's mother moved away completely, saying the town reminded her of shadows. For those who knew the Jamisons, closure never came, only distance. Meanwhile, the forest, indifferent and vast, offers no apologies. The trail where their truck was found has eroded. Time has taken the tire marks, the footprints, the outlines. All that's left is memory and questions. Theories still circulate, new voices picking up old clues, but nothing new ever really emerges. No confession, no new evidence, just the same eerie timeline and a family caught in its center. The Jamisons never got a conclusion, only a discovery. And even that gave no clarity, only more space for shadows to grow. It's that absence of answers that has given the case its power. People don't fear what happened, they fear not knowing what happened. Because in the story of the Jamisons, there's a realization that chills deeper than any horror. Sometimes people disappear, and the world doesn't leave breadcrumbs. It leaves silence. and sometimes that silence is the loudest part of all. So the question lingers, what really happened to the Jamison family? Was it madness, carefully shared between two broken minds, a tragic accident wrapped in strange circumstances, or something older, something nameless that waits in the quiet corners of the world? The case refuses to choose. It doesn't allow neat endings or easy explanations. It sits at the intersection of the real and the surreal, daring anyone who hears it to make sense of it. True crime stories often follow patterns, a suspect, a motive, a clue left behind. But the Jamisons left no trail. They left confusion, contradiction, and a story with more questions than answers. Their truck was found, their money was untouched, their dog was waiting, their bodies were discovered, but even that brought no closure. They lay side by side under open sky, untouched by time until the forest finally let them go. Not buried, not hidden, just left there. What they saw in those final hours, what they felt or feared, remains locked in silence. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps it was something that chased them not through the woods, but through their minds. Theories will always abound: spiritual warfare, mental collapse, crime, or even something far more elusive. Every explanation explains something, but none explain everything. And so the Jamison case endures, not because it's unsolved, but because it's unsolvable. It's a story that draws you in and refuses to let you leave unchanged. A family stepped into the wilderness looking for peace, for a place to start over. What they found was never seen, only felt. In the heavy air, the fading trail, the final photo of a smiling child. The legacy of the Jamisons isn't just a mystery, it's a mirror. A reminder that for all our tools, our logic, our science, we still live in a world that doesn't always reveal its truths. Some doors don't open. Some questions don't get answered. And some families vanish, not because of what was done to them, but because of what they carried with them. Fear, hope, secrets. In the end, the forest kept its promise. It gave them silence. The rest of us were left with noise, pages of speculation, threads of half-truths, and the knowledge that some stories aren't meant to be solved, just told and remembered.